From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York and to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, I'm Taylor Riggs.
And from Washington, D.C., I'm Kevin Cirilli. David Weston is out today. Welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business.
And Kevin, I want to get right straight to that world of business and get a check on the equity markets. Joining us now, Abigail Doolittle. Abigail, seems to be relatively risk-on today.
It is indeed, Taylor. We do have a risk-on tone for the most part for the financial markets here in the U.S. We have sharp gains higher for stocks. The S&P 500 up about 1.4%. We have that tech-heavy NASDAQ up even more, up 2.6%. But there are nuances today to the risk-on tone. And I say that because we have the Dow Transports up just slightly, up 0.2% as the airlines and the car rental companies and some of the other transportation companies are lagging. We also have oil sharply lower, down 3%. Those are tells on some worries about the virus. We, of course, have numbers coming out of Europe and other parts of the world that are not so encouraging, some clusters here in New York. So as folks worry about the possibility of a second wave or even the second wave that is seeming to be starting, especially in other parts of the world, you see those parts of the market hanging back. That's exactly what happened in January. In addition, as you know, Taylor, the bond market here in the U.S. is closed for the holiday, but another haven, the Japanese yen, up for a second day in a row. In fact, over the last two sessions, dollar against the yen down the most since middle of September. So yes, on the surface, it is risk on, but below the surface, there are some nuances to keep in mind.
Thank you, as always, there, Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle. Now, investors have been watching for any signs of additional fiscal stimulus, but any chance for a deal looking a little bit less likely. President Trump's attempt to spark negotiations on another round of virus relief falling flat, with both House Democrats and Republicans on Capitol Hill balking at the White House's latest offer. For more perspective, I want to bring in Ed Mills, Washington policy analyst at Raymond James. Ed, I'm curious, it seems like the gains in the last few days within the markets seem like we're pricing in some sort of additional fiscal stimulus. What do you see?
I think that's correct. I think one thing that investors are focused on is not necessarily on the exact timing, but they see the floor moving up. Initially it was $1 trillion offer from the White House and from Republicans. Last week it was at $1.6 trillion. On Friday it went to $1.8 trillion. And over the weekend you had a view from the White House that it could go even higher. So what the market is really focused on is ultimately there will be a package that gets struck and implemented, and hopefully that will be done to key industries that we were just talking about.
Ed, coming up, we're going to talk about the political ramifications of President Trump's dip in the polls. But how have the markets been reacting to Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden seemingly widening his lead in the polls ahead of November 3rd?
Yeah, we host a call every Monday here at Raymond James and kind of poll our clients as it relates to the political impact of this. And what we see in that is that as the chance of a Democratic sweep goes up, that is also a view that the total dollar amount of stimulus that goes up. And so from a market perspective, it is not the normal, oh, we're concerned about regulation. It is more hope and anticipation for good support from the fiscal side of the House being there for the economy.
Ed, it seems like there's also been a shift in the markets between originally a blue wave seeming bad for equity prices because it meant higher regulation, higher taxes. And yet that narrative has shifted in the last few days to a blue wave, meaning more fiscal stimulus and that classic reflation trade. Is that something you two are looking at?
Yeah, absolutely. A subset to that also is more conversation about what would, if there is a blue wave, if there is a $3 trillion plus package, how should we look at kind of the bond market? Is that going to cause the long end of the curve to increase because there could be some inflation concerns? And so those stocks, such as financials, getting a bid tied to that. Is that also kind of looking at you could see a recovery because there is getting closer to a vaccine, getting progress on therapeutics. So a reflation, a reopening trade, getting more steam as kind of a confluence of events are coming together that could be beneficial to those stocks.
Meanwhile, specifically as it relates to a blue wave, what would that mean for the energy sector in particular?
I think one thing that people have looked at the energy sector kind of in a blue wave is thinking a recovery package would probably have more carrots than sticks to the energy sector, that the economy is more important than politics. We have gone through 4 years of a champion for the energy sector with deregulation in Donald Trump, but energy has been the worst performer of the S&P. So it's a reminder that it almost doesn't matter who's in the White House. Supply demand outside of politics is far more important than an individual regulation. So I don't think there is the same concern with a Democratic sweep than there would have been kind of a couple of years ago.
And though, what does your analysis tell you about the pass-through rates, right, and the money supply through private versus public? So if you raise taxes but you add fiscal stimulus, is it net 1-1 and it nets out to 0? Or is there a difference because one is through public and one is through private? How do you think about that?
So I think what the investors that I'm speaking with are thinking about it is that before doing that analysis, they're thinking about it in a timing perspective of the fiscal support is likely to come first. Any changes to tax policy are probably going to take longer. When I've talked to individuals in D.C., they tell me to think about it in a short term versus long term, that in the short term, if there were to be a recovery package, if Joe Biden wins, there might be a pay for it, but it's going to be relatively limited. So that gives the time for the economy to recover as it's getting a super boost of fiscal policy. We have robust and aggressive monetary policy. And then we get to the end of 21 into 22. And is there a phased in targeted tax policy that would be a potential headwind to the market? But people are thinking about their portfolio for the next 12 months, not necessarily what happens in 22 and beyond.
So smart, so smart. And here in Washington, they're just all saying it's a question of how much money, how much stimulus, and just a matter of that price tag number as opposed to whether or not it happens before November 3rd. Just before I let you go, Ed, in terms of the dynamic of the volatility surrounding mail-in voting, has that risk diminished?
It hasn't diminished, but I think what we have changed from on is that probably the biggest question we've gotten, which is interesting, is not who wins, but will we know a winner in and around election night? And so investors are focused more on the fact that mail-in ballots are actually counted in advance of Election Day in most states, and that's what could give us a potential more information on election night.
And Governor Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan, a Democrat, over the weekend saying that she's not holding herself to what she described as an artificial deadline of election night. Thanks to Ed Mills, Washington policy analyst at Raymond James. And coming up, as the Supreme Court nominee Judge Amy Coney Barrett faces the Senate lawmakers, we'll discuss the implications. That's next. This is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm Kevin Cirilli with my co-host Taylor Riggs in New York, and voters are getting their first look at Judge Amy Coney Barrett as the Senate Judiciary Committee holds its first day of confirmation hearings that are all but certain to lead to President Trump's pick being placed on the high court just days before the election. For more insight, we're joined now by Mary Ziegler. She is the Stearns Weaver Miller Professor at Florida State University College of Law. She is also the author of the new book, Abortion and Law in America, Roe versus Wade to the Present. We're thrilled to have you, Professor, with us on this topic and specifically on this day. What are you going to be looking for? It's the opening statements today. Tomorrow we get to the Q&A portion. What are you going to be looking for from the Q&A portion for Judge Amy Coney Barrett?
Well, we're not going to expect Judge Coney Barrett really to answer questions directly. There's a reason for that. Ever since Robert Bork's failed nomination to the court, nominees have pretty studiously avoided saying much of anything, but I think we can sometimes read between the lines. I'll be curious to see if Judge Coney Barrett will call Roe v. Wade settled law. Settled law has come to have a particular meaning in the anti-abortion community, essentially the argument being that Roe v. Wade has failed to settle our abortion wars. So if she calls Roe v. Wade precedent, but won't say it's settled law, that may tip her hand a little bit. I'm curious, too, just to see how she plays a lot of questions about her views about everything from the Affordable Care Act to abortion, because she has more of a paper trail than some of the nominees we've seen in recent years.
And Professor, talk to me a little bit more about that, the way we've intertwined personal views to perhaps the way we can hear cases on a legal basis and make opinions based on that. Have we focused too much on her personal views, or are we rightfully looking at her personal views and basing the way she can look at a case in front of her based on that?
I mean, in my opinion, her personal views have been too much of a focal point, simply because we have a long and kind of open tradition almost of presidents picking justices with an eye to the results those justices will deliver. And we know this. President Trump has said this on multiple occasions about specific rulings, including but not limited to Roe v. Wade. So the fact that she was chosen it's an open secret that it's in part to engineer certain results. And I don't really see what the point of focusing on her religious beliefs or her prior pro-life commitments does, given that we already know that that's kind of the trajectory of many Supreme Court nominations.
It's just fascinating, just so close to an election, the themes of women's health issues, Catholicism, so many of these issues really out on the campaign trail where they are being talked about, including, mind you, whether or not Joe Biden would add the number of justices on the bench. Right. Let me ask you specifically, Mary, about what we know about how Judge Amy Coney Barrett's record is on financial regulatory matters. Do we know anything about her based upon her previous record?
Well, she doesn't have much of a record, right? She's only been a judge on the federal bench since 2017, but we know that she's had some concerns about the kind of federal administrative state as a whole, and that would include when it comes to financial regulatory matters. But I think one of the sort of brilliant strokes of choosing her is that while she has a paper trail, her record as a judge is relatively limited, so we're really only kind of making educated guesses.
I want to talk about some other educated guesses, particularly around the ACA, which we know hearing is coming up a week after the election. What do we know? What can we glean about not only her views, but the composition of the court, how they view the individual mandate, and if that really is the key issue in the hearing a week after the election?
Well, we know that Amy Coney Barrett was pretty skeptical of Chief Justice John Roberts' opinion that was the kind of key deciding vote to save the Affordable Care Act the last time around. Now, critics, people who support Barrett's nomination will stress that the current ACA case is different from that one, and that Barrett's criticisms don't necessarily apply to the case that's currently before the Cato Institute, for example, has made this point, the case that's currently before the court. I think her presence on the court in general creates kind of an insurance policy for conservatives, right? Because we saw this summer Chief Justice Roberts and sometimes Neil Gorsuch peeling away from the other conservatives, for example, to deliver votes that meant that at least DACA has had a reprieve for the moment, or that Title VII protects LGBT employees, or striking down an abortion restriction. So with an additional conservative on the court, that kind of breakaway vote stops mattering as much. And it also creates at least the possibility of a kind of more conservative coalition on the court that could push for more dramatic changes more quickly.
So on that point precisely, I want to follow up on that, especially if she is confirmed and she is on the Supreme Court and it's a 6-3 dynamic. I mean, who would the middle justices be, for lack of a better term? Because obviously it would have a conservative tilt, but as we've seen in the past, we have seen these breakaways in the past. So what would there be, almost a middle faction and then a left and a right, or no?
Well, it's too early to say where Amy Coney Barrett would fit on that spectrum, right? I mean, we've already seen some factions sort of begin to emerge. Justices Thomas and Alito have tended to vote together all the time and been the kind of further right wing of the court on a variety of issues, whether that's President Trump's tax records or abortion or everything in between. And then Justice Gorsuch has emerged as sort of a maverick figure who will sometimes write very, very conservative rulings and sometimes write not very conservative rulings, really depending on the topic. So he can be a middle vote, really depending on the issue. And then you have, I think, Justices Roberts and Kavanaugh, who are not particularly likely to be won over by arguments about the substantive law, but who are more concerned with either the court's institutional legitimacy or its reputation. And so on some topics, I think that would make probably Kavanaugh the middle vote, because he does seem to share some of Roberts' concerns about the court's reputation and image. And that might, for example, give him pause about striking down the ACA or overturning Roe v. Wade. And then you have someone like Gorsuch who might be more open to a wider range of arguments, but not necessarily as concerned about optics or reputation. And we simply don't know where Amy Coney Barrett is going to fit in the equation. I think the expectation, given some of her writings, has been that she may be more ideologically aligned with Thomas and Alito, but really only time will tell if that turns out to be true.
And Professor, final question here. What's the risk in the next 4 days something goes wrong? What would that risk be where this doesn't turn out the way that we expect it to go?
In terms of her not getting confirmed?
Correct. Yeah.
I mean, it's very unlikely because Amy Coney Barrett, I'm sure, is a student of history and has seen when judicial nominations can go south. And I don't think she would disclose anything that would doom the nomination. And the sort of unfortunate side effect of that is that Supreme Court nomination hearings are almost content-free now. And the best we can do is to kind of read between the lines and look at the sort of almost secret code that nominees are using to signal what they might be doing. But I would be extremely surprised if Amy Coney Barrett did anything to damage her chances, because she understands exactly how the game is played, as most nominees have.
Mary Ziegler, Florida State University, professor of law, thank you as always for your time. Kevin, we're now going to turn on over to the First Word News. We're going to start with this story. President Trump returns to the campaign trail today after declaring himself, quote, in great shape following his bout with coronavirus. He'll hold a rally in Orlando, Florida, kicking off at least 4 straight days of political events. In addition to Florida, Trump is expected to travel to Pennsylvania, Iowa, and North Carolina this week. He's hoping that resuming his signature rallies can help reverse his sagging poll numbers. And British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is imposing new restrictions on the UK, all to control the surge of COVID-19. His plan includes closing bars and pubs in parts of the country where the outbreak is spreading fastest. Johnson told Parliament today the toughest measures will go into effect Wednesday.
I take no pleasure whatsoever in imposing restrictions on these businesses, many of which have gone to great lengths to reopen as safely as possible. Nor do I want to stop people enjoying themselves. But we must act to save lives.
Johnson has unveiled a 3-tiered system based on risk level. He says he's determined to avoid a second national lockdown. And a coalition of technology companies is stepping up its effort to fight cyber attacks just weeks before the U.S. presidential election. The coordinated takedown being spearheaded by Microsoft, using a federal court order unsealed today to begin dismantling one of the world's most dangerous botnets. The goal is to disable a global network of infected computers created by malware known as TrickBot. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. And stay with us because still ahead, part of our interview with Sheila Bair, Center for Financial Stability Senior Fellow and former FDIC Chair. Her take on who's responsible for getting the economy back to pre-COVID conditions next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. We've been speaking with Sheila Bair, Center for Financial Stability Senior Fellow. We discuss who is responsible for getting the economy out of current conditions.
I think there are some things the Fed could have done to help the real economy better, and we can talk about those. But just to the extent households and small businesses have to rely on banks as credit, that's primarily your transmission mechanism, and you can't force them to lend. And especially when big banks can make a lot more money without credit risk by doing, underwriting, trading, et cetera. their incentives to do small business loans in particular are reduced unless it's guaranteed, as we saw with the PPP program. They've shown very little interest in the Main Street lending program. So again, you have to rely on small banks, and they've been stressed. So yes, Jay Powell is right. The tools are not elegant. The traditional tools are really not well equipped to help here. So I think there's almost a moral imperative. I know he's been criticized for getting political and urging fiscal relief. I also think there's a moral imperative here, though, for the Fed too, because the income and wealth inequality impact of the current interventions, because it has really propped up the corporate sector, propped up equity markets, which overwhelmingly benefits the very wealthiest in this country. It is almost a moral imperative for the Fed to press as well for fiscal help for Main Street, which we're not getting right now.
So how does the Fed then do more here? In your opinion, what else should they be doing?
Well, I think so on their corporate debt interventions, I think they could have focused more on primary debt issuance, be more surgically focused on primary debt issuance. I thought they've never intervened in corporate debt markets before. This is huge. But when they did it, they kind of broadly intervened in the secondary market, which helped investors. But really the point was to help corporations as employers who needed access to the public debt markets to continue to fund themselves. Really no focus. So they set it up, they haven't used it on primary debt issuance. And then by just providing this broad, backstop to the secondary market, there really were no strings attached. So you've seen a lot of the beneficiaries directly and indirectly of Fed interventions in the corporate debt markets. They're still doing buybacks. They're still doing dividends. They're pursuing M&A. It's hard to see that much of that money is flowing into job creation or job preservation. So I think they could have been more targeted and surgical on their corporate debt interventions. In terms of household help, I've really advocated for getting much more serious about central bank digital currency and giving households and maybe small businesses too the ability to access directly or indirectly reserve accounts, so that when you need to increase money supply in a distressed situation like this, give it directly to the sectors that are stressed. Right now, again, we're transmitting it through banks primarily and into loans, and there's a lot of debt out there already. So households in particular, and small businesses right now, they really need cash. They do really need more loans. So exploring this new technology to see if that's realistic to do that. Obviously, it needs to be authorized by Congress. It does arguably fuzzy lines between fiscal and monetary, which is why there should be tight controls around it, and it needs to be authorized by Congress. But I just wish the Fed would get more serious at looking at technology, because I think it could be a good automatic stabilizer to pump money directly into the sectors that need it when we get into a situation like this.
That was Sheila Bair, Center for Financial Stability Senior Fellow. More next. This is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm Kevin Cirilli with my co-host Taylor Riggs in New York. South Carolina is up for grabs. Senator Lindsey Graham's seat in the Palmetto State is not a sure thing, with his Democratic challenger Jamie Harrison raising more money in the third quarter than any other Senate candidate in history. Wow. For more on the race, let's bring in Bloomberg News' congressional editor, Anna Edgerton. Anna, this was really supposed to be Senator Lindsey Graham this was an all but given. What happened? Why is this race so close?
Yeah, the fact that we're even talking about this race, South Carolina electing possibly a Democratic senator, shows just how far this blue wave could go in the direction of the Democrats, depending on turnout and depending on the final weeks before the election. You did mention that Jamie Harrison, the Democrat challenging Graham for his seat, raised a record amount in the third quarter. He raised $57 million, which is more than any other Senate candidate in history. The second most was Beto O'Rourke in Texas when he was challenging Ted Cruz. So, we do know that it's not a given if you raise the most money that you'll win that seat.
And I'm very curious if this is a national election, Biden versus Trump, or if there are some more local level issues in the state that are more of a focus.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And we're certainly seeing national money. There's a lot of money flooding into this race that's not coming just from South Carolina. But South Carolina is an interesting state because, yes, it is conservative, but it's a kind of a fiscal conservative. It's not as focused on the social issues as some of the other states in the Deep South. You see people like Mark Sanford, a previous representative from the state, a previous governor, who was really a fiscal conservative, and that's kind of more the brand of conservatism that we see in South Carolina. He resigned from the House of Representatives because he didn't really fit in with President Trump's Republican Party. Lindsey Graham has made a different calculation. He has gone full in on President Trump, and I think he's really drawing a lot of attention and kind of paying the price for that.
Well, that's what I find just fascinating here is that you just go a couple miles up the interstate to North Carolina, and you've got Senator Thom Tillis against Cal Cunningham, and he's trying to distance himself between himself and President Trump. Has Senator Lindsey Graham in the past couple of days, Anna, done anything to try to put some distance between himself and the president?
No, he has focused very strongly on President Trump's nomination of Amy Coney Barrett to fill the Supreme Court seat left by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And, we must remind viewers that Graham is the Judiciary Committee chairman and heading those confirmation hearings right now. So he's kind of banking on this moment to remind conservative voters in South Carolina that, you might not like what President Trump has done, his personal style, some other actions that he's taken, but you're getting these conservative justices confirmed to the Supreme Court, which could cement a conservative majority for a generation.
Anna, how much of the shift that we've seen when Graham won big in 2016 to now looking neck and neck, how much of that is a shift in what we've seen with how he has gone from a critic to a supporter of Trump, or is there something else going on entirely?
Well, it is interesting to see the evolution of Lindsey Graham in 2016 during the Republican primary, who was very critical of President Trump. And now he has tied himself entirely to the president's state, becoming one of his closest confidants and golfing buddies, which is a huge shift for Lindsey Graham, who was a very close ally of the late Senator John McCain and much more of a kind of defense hawk, fiscal hawk, kind of traditional conservative. Now he, as have many other Republicans, have completely gotten on board with the kind of Trump brand of conservatism, especially when it comes to labeling Democrats as part of the radical left that wants to dramatically reshape America as we know it.
It's really fascinating, especially as we're watching right now and listening right now to Senator Lindsey Graham before the Senate Judiciary Committee orchestrating and really overseeing the confirmation process to Judge Amy Coney Barrett. Taylor, I'm old enough to remember when candidate Donald Trump gave out the cell phone number of Senator Lindsey Graham out on the campaign trail just a couple of years ago. They've come a long way.
Yeah, this will be very interesting, Kevin, and this is where I love to take a break from markets and be able to chat with you about just the tone and the shift that you've seen from 2016 to now. When we remember in 2016, a lot of the issues was if you didn't like Trump, it was voting for a more conservative Supreme Court. And that certainly then look where we are 4 years later. Certainly seems to be another similar situation.
Exactly. And, they're giving out cell phone numbers. Then Lindsey Graham took like a hammer and trashed his own cell phone. I mean, it's remarkable. Any way you paint it, Taylor, President Trump is the new Republican establishment, and the establishment of yesteryear is done.
Well, I'm going from the establishment of being your co-anchor to the establishment of you calling me your co-marathon running buddy on air. How about that?
I just don't want to get in trouble.
I'm going to save us all. We're going to go on over to the First Word News, and we're going to do that with Mark Crumpton. Mark, take it away.
Taylor, Kevin, thank you. As our Anna Edgerton was just telling us, Senate confirmation hearings began today for President Trump's Supreme Court nominee. Judge Amy Coney Barrett will cast herself as a judge committed to avoid policymaking and keeping her personal views out of rulings. Democrats are concerned that Judge Barrett will rule against abortion rights if she is confirmed as expected. The nation's top infectious disease expert says he was taken out of context in a new campaign ad that praises President Trump's handling of the coronavirus pandemic. The ad includes a clip of Dr. Anthony Fauci saying, quote, "I can't imagine that anybody could be doing more." Dr. Fauci made the comments during a March interview with Fox and said they were part of a broad statement about the efforts of federal public health officials and were used without his permission. Dr. Fauci says he has never publicly endorsed any political candidate. One of Netflix's biggest hits is about to be available free on Pluto TV, the streaming service owned by Viacom CBS. Pluto will show episodes of Narcos starting October 20th. Narcos is a drama about the Latin American drug trade. Pluto acquired exclusive rights to the series on advertising-supported streaming for the next 6 months. European Union officials have agreed to impose sanctions on Russian officials and organizations blamed for the poisoning of Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny. Those suspected of being involved will have their assets frozen and they will be banned from traveling in Europe. Navalny, who is a fierce critic of Russian President Vladimir Putin, fell ill in August during a domestic flight in Russia. TASS confirmed he was poisoned by a Soviet-era nerve agent. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg.
Thank you, Mark. And coming up, we'll get the Republican perspective on President Trump's campaign restart following his COVID diagnosis. And we do that with Michael Steele of Hamilton Place Strategies. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm Taylor Riggs with my co-running buddy in Washington, D.C., and that is Kevin Cirilli. And Kevin, President Trump returning to the campaign trail today, really hoping to reverse unfavorable polling trends. A new Washington Post ABC poll showing former Vice President Joe Biden leading by 12 percentage points among likely voters with just 3 weeks to go until the election. For more, we want to welcome Michael Steele. He's a partner with Hamilton Place Strategies, adjunct professor at the McCourt School of Public Policy, Georgetown University, and former senior advisor to Jeb Bush's presidential campaign. With all of those titles, it certainly is great to have you on the program. And if we do believe the polls and the current president is behind, what do you want to see in the next few weeks to really turn things around?
Yeah, I mean, he's coming out of the pit several laps behind. He's short on time, short on money. What I would like to see from the president going forward is exactly what I think the American people have been hoping to see for much of the past year, just a change, a desire to take this pandemic seriously, take the economic devastation that it has wrought seriously, some actions to work with Democrats on Capitol Hill to actually get additional relief to suffering American families, and a tone that recognizes that humility and compassion are part of the job of being president of the United States.
All right, but I was out on the campaign trail last week, and I said to Rick Grinnell, what's the strategy here? He said it's to turn conservative districts blood red and to amplify the turnout and to run up the margins in parts of Pennsylvania and parts of Michigan that they already won 4 years ago and that they want to win again. But let me put to you a question, Michael Steele, that we were talking about earlier, which is, okay, head down to South Carolina, head up to North Carolina. How do you convince constituents who might be crossing over to Biden to stick with the Republican Party on down ballot races?
That's going to be awfully tough. I mean, I think that, given Cal Cunningham's shenanigans in North Carolina, his incredibly poor explanation of what seems to be indefensible behavior, I do think there's a possibility that Donald Trump could lose that state and Tom Tillis could still win his Senate race. But if you look at South Carolina, the numbers for Jamie Harrison versus Lindsey Graham are basically spot on, exactly the same as the numbers for President Trump versus Joe Biden. There is just not a lot of ticket splitting going on right now.
What is the risk politically for both parties as the Judge Amy Coney Barrett hearings and before the Senate Judiciary Committee begin the Q&A portion tomorrow in Washington?
Well, I think for Republicans, the danger is that you get hit with a process foul. You're rushing forward too quickly. You're jamming this through before the election. That is a popular message, but not an overwhelmingly popular message, and frankly, not one that I think many people are going to vote on. The danger for the Democrats is that they are seen as attacking her faith, attacking her family, supporting some fairly unpopular positions on issues that will be coming before the court. So I think that the president and his team and a lot of Senate Republicans are hoping that Democrats overstep themselves, that they say some things that are, well, frankly, insensitive to people of faith and to many Americans.
How are you looking at not only this confirmation process and the confirmation hearings, but the bickering between Trump and Biden as local people go to the polls? Are they voting for Biden-Trump, or are they voting for other local issues? And what is the risk that you start to see on the local level voting for national issues? Is that a risk?
Absolutely a risk. I think that the president in some ways blots out the sun when it comes to this contest. I think that almost every voter that I know is going to their polling place or filling out their ballot by mail really in order to vote on Trump v. Biden. And I think that there could be some effect in down ballot races where people just kind of vote the party line one way or the other, rather than taking the time to seriously look at their local candidates, their local races, and make those decisions based on the merits, which I hope they will do.
From the debates perspective, I mean, debate off this week. Do you think it's smart for the president to skip out on the debates, or should they be back at the negotiating table with the debate commissions and trying to have these things?
Look, the town hall style debate was probably going to be the weakest format for President Trump. It requires him to listen while ordinary Americans ask questions patiently. It also requires him to show empathy. The people who are the masters of this format, like Bill Clinton, and I think Joe Biden would be very good at it, just have a different skill set than the president. All that having been said, it is daft for a candidate who is short on money, short on time, and trailing in the polls not to want to get on that debate stage, not to want those millions and millions of eyeballs, and not to want the opportunity for the former vice president, who is given to the occasional gaffe, the occasional lapse in thought or judgment or speech, give that opportunity to him to have that mistake, to make that error in front of all those people. I don't understand the president's strategy in avoiding debates right now.
Michael Steele, you are one of the more consummate insiders in terms of Washington, D.C. and conservative circles, especially amongst strategists. Regardless of the outcome of November 3rd election, regardless of whether or not President Trump gets reelected, whether or not Republicans hold on to the majority in the Senate, are the conversations of what's next for the Republican Party already being had quietly, but are those conversations underway?
100%. I mean, look, the president is a unique individual. There is really no such thing as Trumpism without Trump. And so I think, and if you look at the coalition that he put together to very narrowly win the Electoral College while losing the popular vote in 2016, leaving aside what may happen in a few weeks, that's not the coalition of the future. That's not the coalition that is going to win presidential elections for the Republican Party in 2024, 28, and beyond. So, yeah, there is a very serious conversation already going on about how you identify the popular, durable, practical portions of the president's agenda and build a party around that, a coalition around that can be competitive on a national level in the future.
Fascinating. And that coalition of the future will be on full display in the months following November 3rd. Our thanks to Michael Steele, who is a partner with Hamilton Place Strategies and, of course, a Republican insider and knows everyone in conservative circles. Coming up, President Trump looks to revive his campaign in Florida tonight with just 3 weeks until Election Day. We get the read on voters in the state from Nikki, Florida Commissioner of Agriculture and Consumer Services. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm Kevin Cirilli, joined by my co-host in New York, Taylor Riggs. The final countdown is on for President Trump and Democratic nominee Joe Biden, with just 22 days until Election Day. This week, we continue our Swing State series and take a closer look at the political landscape in Florida, where President Trump is set to hold his first rally since falling ill with COVID-19 tonight. Joining us for more is Nikki, Florida Commissioner of Agriculture and Consumer Services. Commissioner, thank you for joining us. I mean, President Trump back on the campaign trail. From an economic standpoint, what impact has the COVID-19 pandemic had on your state in particular?
It's been disastrous. We know that the president not only downplayed the pandemic, had no plan to get us through it. And we all know that because of the cases and the amount of deaths and how across the entire country and here in the state of Florida, we can't have an economic rebound. Tourism here in the state of Florida is our _1 economic driver. Agriculture is #2. We are a $1 trillion economic driver for the country. We are one of the highest GDPs in the entire nation. And most of that is from tourism. So until which time that we can actually beat COVID, tourists aren't going to come back here to the state of Florida. We know we're with between our theme parks and SeaWorld, where you all guys are today, as well as Universal Studios and Disney, we saw even last week, Disney took more 9,000 people that they laid off. A lot of our small businesses and a lot of our hotels and restaurants had furloughed a lot of people during the original outbreak. But unfortunately, those furloughs are turning into permanent losses. We have 1.6 million people here in the state of Florida that are currently unemployed. And there has been no plan, neither from the president or from our governor, to actually get our economy rebounding. And that's because there's no plan to get COVID under control and to make sure that we beat COVID here in the state.
Commissioner, what do you need from Capitol Hill? Because they're having these round-the-clock negotiations, supposedly, about fiscal stimulus. You mentioned tourism specifically. They're talking about tourism. What do you need for Republicans and Democrats to pass on fiscal stimulus?
There's a couple of things. First and foremost, I also oversee the school nutrition program. So we need to make sure that the USDA is continuing paying for a lot of the programs that were already stood up during the first part of this pandemic. We also need to make sure that we are getting the food into our homes. That means having stimulus dollars for the food banks, but really more importantly, into our small businesses. We know that a significant chunk of the money that was allocated during the first few stimuluses went to the top 1%ers, went to the top corporations, went back into the stock market. And we know that is not even close to a snapshot of what is happening in our American homes and homes across the state of Florida. Our small businesses, our small farmers are continuing to struggle. So the money needs to go right into the heart of the people that are suffering. And those are the individuals to help stimulate the economy, to make sure that our small businesses have exactly what they need to keep their doors open, the restaurants, the hotels, which again are starting to actually lay off employees, not just furlough. So the money needs to go to those small businesses and to reinvigorate the middle class here in the state of Florida, and not put it back into the stock market or into the top 1% corporations. Certainly we hope that the corporations would again expand their hiring process, but unfortunately we know what they're doing. They then take out their dividends and recap all of their profits. So that way that they are the ones who are gaining the system, and that money is not going down to the hardworking Floridians and to the people across our entire country. So that's where the money needs to go. Into our small farmers, our small businesses.
You mentioned small farmers. What changes do you want to see in the trade war to boost your agricultural business?
Well, I have been a strong opponent to USMCA, which was the old NAFTA deal. Because what happened is that we traded the better interests of our Florida farmers and our Southeast farmers for the auto industry. And of course, there's a happy balance. But what has happened here in the state of Florida since NAFTA was first signed is that we have seen a significant, over 200 to 400% increase in the amount of Mexican products that are coming here into the state of Florida and throughout the Southeast, which means that our small farmers here that are trying to make ends meet, trying to feed not just their communities, the state, but the world, quite honestly, are having to compete with Mexican growers who are paying 25 cents a day for their farm labor, which we know here in America is unacceptable. So making sure that we have actual plans in place to equal that playing field. Our farmers here are some of the hardest workers in the entire world. So creating a level playing field is all that we're asking for, making sure that people across the entire country are actually buying domestic products, demanding that. As we all know, the power is in the purse strings. And so if our Americans are demanding domestic products, that will put a huge ripple effect into some of the trade issues that are happening across the entire country, and especially with USMCA.
Commissioner Freed, Florida, swing state, final countdown, 3 weeks to go. I mean, the polls are tightening. How important is it going to be for Democrats to win Florida? How can they win it back from 2016?
Yeah, we all know that the only way that Trump can actually win is by winning Florida, which is why he is putting his first rally here in the state of Florida, his reckless behavior is just a clear example of his lack of leadership on COVID, to have a rally here in the state of Florida. But I know that the people of the state, as I've traveled throughout the entire state, especially in the last few months, talking to a lot of our down ballot candidates, we've got the most diverse candidates across the state that we've ever had, filling every single seat across the entire state. And so the message is very clear. We have an individual who we have an opportunity to elect, and that is Joe Biden and Kamala Harris as a ticket. Somebody who is going to roll up his sleeves, has a plan in place for our economic recovery, getting COVID under control, making sure that we are actually respected again across the entire world. We have lost that prestige in the international community. And so I know here in the state of Florida, we as Democrats are not just taking our message to Democrats. We're taking our message to NPAs, independents, and to moderate Republicans who understand that the Republican Party of today is not the party that they joined. Today's Republican Party is that of Donald Trump, which creates divisive politics, divisive social issues, only taking care of the one percenters.
Yeah, Nikki Fried, Florida Commissioner of Agricultural and Consumer Services, thank you, as always, for joining us. And make sure to stick with us, because coming up, Balance of Power continues on Bloomberg Radio with Kevin Cirilli. We hear from Brendan Buck, former advisor to Speaker Paul Ryan, on the latest stimulus. This is Balance of Power, Bloomberg TV and Radio.